Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro is ordering the closure of his country's embassies and consulates in the United States. The announcement comes as the Trump administration backs Venezuela's opposition leader. The country has been in turmoil with large anti-government protests that are calling for change. Mola Lenghi has the latest from Washington.
Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro brushed off international calls for him to step down while addressing the country's Supreme Court Thursday. Maduro's government is feeling the pressure following violent protests there. Supporters of opposition leader Juan Guaido clashed with police in the streets of Caracas. On Wednesday, Guaido went into hiding after declaring himself interim president, adding more drama to the current political dysfunction in the oil-rich nation. President Trump pledged to support Guaido, prompting Maduro to order all American diplomats out of the country within 72 hours. But Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said the embattled leader doesn't have the authority to make that call.
The United States proudly recognized National Assembly President Juan Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela. The time for debate is done. The regime of former President Nicolas Maduro is illegitimate.
President Trump said the U.S. is monitoring the situation but will not intervene. For now.
We're not considering anything, but all options are on the table.
At the request of the United States, the UN Security Council will meet to discuss the ongoing crisis in Venezuela Saturday. There's a lot of uncertainty in the country. Food and medicine are scarce, and inflation is up 1 million%. Mola Lenghi, CBS News, Washington.
And joining me now from Washington is Ted Piccone. He is a senior fellow on the Project on International Order and Strategy and the Latin America Initiative at the Brookings Institution. Ted, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks.
So in his speech to the Venezuelan Supreme Court, Maduro said that he'll accept a plan laid out by Mexico and Uruguay to hold talks with the opposition. What do you see as what do you see that as a sign of? Is that a potentially positive sign here moving forward?
It's a small positive sign, and we've seen it before. I mean, the pressure is clearly growing on Maduro, and he's slowly realizing that he's going to have to come up with some new tactics to deal with all the pressure. The pressure is coming, of course, principally from within the country, and these massive protests that took place yesterday, I think, did have an important effect. On top of that, you have the international pressure, and when countries like Mexico and Uruguay, which have generally been friendlier to Maduro, start pushing toward this idea of a negotiated outcome, I think that's at least moving in the right direction. In the past, however, when they've tried these kinds of negotiations, the opposition has gotten nothing and has walked away from it because there's no trust between the two parties.
Well, Venezuela's military has come out in support of Nicolas Maduro. How difficult would it be to remove him from power if no agreements can be reached?
No, this is the most critical factor in the whole game. The armed forces are under Maduro's control. He has paid them off in various ways. They control key parts of the economy and the ports and the infrastructure, the energy sectors. So without the armed forces on the side of the opposition, you're going to see Maduro retain control.
Well, President Trump has spoken positively of other controversial leaders from nations like Russia, Egypt, the Philippines, even North Korea. Why does the White House view Venezuela and Nicolas Maduro differently?
Well, in my view, it's really a matter of ideological opposition to the whole socialist program that Maduro has followed. You see the same thing with Cuba and Nicaragua, where the administration has come out pretty strongly against these regimes, using the language of a kind of pro-democracy point of view. But they feel very differently when it's a conservative-leaning government, for example, in Brazil, where you have the new president of Brazil, pretty extreme rhetorically, and, you know, the Trump administration is embracing him.
Well, when speaking to reporters on Thursday, it's interesting, President Trump went so far as to compare the Venezuelan president to his own political opponents in the United States. Let's listen to what he said.
Well, we're looking at Venezuela. It's a very sad situation. That was the richest state in all of that area. That's a big, beautiful area, and by far the richest. And now it's one of the poorest places in the world. That's what socialism gets you when they want to raise your taxes to 70%.
All right, so there we heard, without mentioning her by name, a reference to Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez's plan for a 70% top tax rate. What's the connection here?
There is no connection. I mean, in my view, it's really a cheap shot. The Venezuelan situation is really a humanitarian, political, economic crisis that is caused by a system that Hugo Chavez, the previous president, and Maduro have imposed on the Venezuelan people. And it's been a disaster. And I think everyone would agree to that. I think now you're seeing it playing into our domestic politics in ways that are really have nothing to do. They're apples and oranges. You know, I think the Maduro case in Venezuela is so extreme, it really has no applicability to our own political debate.
Well, in 2017, President Trump said that he is open to using a military option to overthrow Nicolas Maduro. This week, he's insisting that all options are on the table. When you consider past U.S. interventions, is the quote-unquote military option something that could ultimately benefit Venezuelans?
I do not see it as a benefit, just the opposite. I think it would unleash potentially a civil war in the country because there would be such a strong rejection of that kind of U.S. role by many, if not the majority of Venezuelans. And that plays entirely into Maduro's hands. We have a long history of interventions in the region, and it would not only turn the table within Venezuela, it would also rally other countries in the region in support of Maduro. And right now, you have the region mostly in favor of the opposition in Venezuela, and you want to keep it that way. And I think the military option really is not a viable one. But what the options could be are increased tightening economic sanctions, increasingly targeting on the energy sector, and this would be an effective way to keep the pressure on Maduro and force him to negotiate an exit.
Well, meantime, Russian President Vladimir Putin is warning the U.S. not to intervene in Venezuela. Are we looking at a modern-day Cold War proxy fight here?
I mean, I think there are shadows of that. You know, we have to keep in mind that the real battle is between Venezuelans, and it's long overdue for them to reach some kind of exit strategy that is in accordance with their own constitution. And what we have now is a standoff between a democratically elected representative of the National Assembly who has the constitutional authority to say that this president, Maduro, is no longer effectively in power because he was elected through fraudulent, unfair elections. And so he doesn't have the authority under the Constitution to govern. And that really creates a very interesting situation. You have two alternatives, and we'll see if it leads to some kind of peaceful negotiated outcome. I think the UN has to get involved and keep the pressure on Maduro to move aside.
All right, we'll continue to watch it closely. Ted Piccone, thanks so much, Ted.
You're welcome.